Caleb and Silas were known in the tri-state area as the Iron Brothers, a nickname earned not from a family legacy, but from the sheer amount of ferrous metal they moved through their salvage yard every month. They didn't deal in household junk or aluminum cans. They specialized in heavy industrial reclamation. Their livelihood depended on identifying value where others saw only rust and liability. However, the last 2 quarters had been brutal for the salvage industry. Steel prices had plateaued, and overhead costs for their massive warehouse and heavy haulers were eating into their reserves. They needed a win, a significant find that went beyond simple scrap value. It was this desperation that led them to an online liquidation auction for a defunct rail depot in the Midwest. The listing was vague, buried on the last page of the catalog: Lot 409, static power generation unit. Non-functional. Heavy corrosion. Buyer assumes all removal costs. The accompanying photo showed a massive boxy steel structure, the size of a shipping container but wider, covered in 50 years of flaking orange rust and grime, sitting in tall grass near a collapsed siding. Most scrappers ignored Lot 409. The logistics of moving something that clearly weighed over 30 tons from a remote location were a nightmare that outweighed the potential scrap value of the steel. But Caleb saw something else. He noticed the heavy-duty lifting lugs welded onto the frame, far more robust than what was standard for a stationary civilian generator. He also noted the ventilation louvers, which were designed for massive airflow, suggesting an engine of immense power lay beneath the rot. On a hunch, and with a significant portion of their remaining operating capital, they placed the winning bid. It was a gamble that made Silas nervous, but Caleb insisted that even if the engine was seized, the copper windings in the generator head alone might cover the transport costs. They won the auction for a surprisingly low price, simply because no one else wanted the headache of moving the beast. The recovery operation took 3 days. They had to hire a specialized heavy-haul lowboy trailer and a 100-ton crane just to lift the unit from the mud that had claimed it for decades. When the crane operator finally hoisted the box, the groaning of the steel cables was deafening. The weight reading on the crane's load indicator shocked everyone: 82,000 pounds. It was significantly heavier than a standard generator set of that footprint should have been. This extra density was the first clue that the brothers had bought something unusual. As the truck groaned under the load, making the slow journey back to their warehouse, the brothers couldn't shake the feeling of anticipation. The unit wasn't just heavy. It felt dense, solid, like a vault rather than a machine. They weren't just hauling scrap. They were hauling a mystery wrapped in half a century of neglect. Upon arriving at their facility, they used their own overhead gantry cranes to carefully position the massive rusted box in the center of the intake bay. Under the harsh halogen lights of the shop, the unit looked even more imposing. The rust was thick, creating a texture like bark, and the smell of ancient creosote and damp earth radiated from the metal. Silas grabbed the oxyacetylene torch while Caleb prepared the impact wrenches. They weren't just going to scrap it immediately. The protocol was always to assess for salvageable parts first. They began with the inspection panels on the side, but the bolts were fused solid by rust. Silas lit the torch, the blue flame hissing as he heated the first bolt until it glowed a cherry red. With a cloud of steam and a sharp crack, the bolt gave way. It took them 4 hours just to remove the exterior access plate. "Hey guys! We are going to take a quick pause here because we need to ask for your massive support. We are currently incredibly close to hitting our major milestone of 10,000 subscribers. It has been a long journey, and we want you to be part of the crew that gets us over the line. If you are enjoying this story and the mystery of what's inside this generator, please smash that subscribe button right now. Also, if you want to support the channel directly so we can keep finding these crazy stories, check out the Super Thanks button below. It helps us immensely. And we are curious. Drop a comment telling us what city and country you are watching from. We love seeing how global our salvage community is. Now, let's get back to the engine room. With the first large panel removed, the brothers expected to see a rat's nest of chewed wires and a rusted-out engine block. Instead, as the heavy steel plate clattered to the concrete floor, a strange smell drifted out. It wasn't the smell of rot or rust. It was the distinct, heavy scent of cosmoline, a wax-like rust inhibitor used by the military and heavy industry for long-term storage. Caleb shined his high-powered inspection light into the dark cavity. The beam cut through the gloom and reflected off something that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't the dull gray of cast iron. It was a vibrant, glossy, industrial green paint. "Silas, bring the ladder," Caleb whispered, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous metal box. He climbed up and leaned into the opening. The interior of the housing was lined with insulation that had protected the core from the temperature fluctuations outside. In the center of the housing sat an engine, but it wasn't the inline 6 or V12 diesel they were expecting. It was a monster. The valve covers were massive, pristine, and endless. Caleb began counting the cylinder heads stretching back into the darkness. 1, 2, 3, 8, 10 on this side alone. He dropped back down, his face pale with shock. "It's a V20, he said, looking at his brother. "It's not a generator engine, Silas. That is an EMD. It's a locomotive engine. A 20-cylinder electromotive diesel." They immediately shifted gears. This was no longer a scrap job. It was an excavation. They spent the next 6 hours carefully cutting away the rest of the rusted enclosure, treating the outer shell like the cocoon of a butterfly. As the final sections of the corroded roof were lifted away by the overhead crane, the full majesty of the machine was revealed. Standing before them, sitting on a specialized vibration-dampening skid, was an EMD 645 series engine. But this wasn't just any train engine. It was immaculate. It lacked the grease, oil leaks, and carbon buildup of a used engine. The paint on the bolts was unbroken. The distinct roots blowers, massive superchargers mounted on the engine, were still covered in their original factory protective paper, now yellowed with age but intact. Caleb scrambled to the data plate riveted to the engine block, wiping away a thin layer of dust with his thumb. The stamping was clear: GM Electromotive Division. Model 20-645E3. Date of MFG, 1968. He looked at the serial numbers. 0 hours, he muttered, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. "Silas, this is a factory-new, 3,600 horsepower locomotive engine from 1968. It's never been fired. It's been sealed in this box for over 50 years. The value of the steel they had bought the unit for was perhaps $2,000. The engine sitting before them, even as a core for rebuilding, was worth tens of thousands. But in this condition, as a new old stock survivor, it was a unicorn. However, the question remained: why would a rail yard order the most powerful engine available in the 1960s, build a custom enclosure for it, seal it in cosmoline, and then leave it in a field to rot for half a century? The brothers realized they hadn't just bought an engine. They had bought a forgotten project, a secret that someone had spent a lot of money to hide in plain sight. The sheer scale of the discovery began to settle in as the adrenaline of the initial reveal wore off. Caleb and Silas stood in silence before the massive green beast, the hum of the warehouse lights the only sound accompanying their heavy breathing. An EMD 20-645E3 was not merely an engine. It was a masterpiece of mid-century American industrial engineering. It was a two-stroke, turbocharged diesel engine capable of producing 3,600 horsepower at 900 revolutions per minute. These were the hearts of the legendary SD-45 locomotives that had conquered the mountain passes of the American West. To find one in a scrapyard was rare. To find one with 0 operating hours, preserved in a time capsule since the height of the Cold War, was statistically impossible. The brothers knew they were looking at an asset that, if functional, could command a price in the 6-figure range from the right buyer. Perhaps a short-line railroad, a marine tug operator, or a power generation plant. Silas, the more mechanically cautious of the two, broke the trance. He moved toward the rear of the engine, where the locomotive prime mover connected to the electrical generation end. In a standard locomotive, this would be a DC generator or an AC alternator designed to feed traction motors on the wheels. However, what he found bolted to the flywheel housing confirmed their earlier suspicions about the unit's purpose. It was a massive, single-bearing alternator, far larger than standard rail specifications, built by Westinghouse. The data plate indicated it was rated for 3 megawatts of continuous power output at 4,160 volts, a medium-voltage configuration used for industrial grids or large facilities. This machine wasn't built to move a train. It was built to power a small city, or perhaps a very specific, isolated military installation. The static power unit designation in the auction listing had been technically correct, but woefully understated. Caleb began a systematic walk-around, looking for the documentation that always accompanied military or government hardware. He found it welded to the subframe near the starter motors, a heavy-duty, screw-top steel tube, painted the same safety yellow as the lifting lugs. The paint on the cap was unbroken, sealed with a lead wire tamper tag stamped with a Department of Defense eagle. He used a pair of side cutters to snip the wire, the soft lead yielding easily. Unscrewing the cap revealed a heavy roll of oil paper, blueprints, and a technical logbook that smelled of old library archives and machine oil. He unrolled the documents on a workbench, smoothing out the curling corners. The header on the first page made his blood run cold. It didn't list a standard railway client. It read, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Project Greek Island, Emergency Power Backup Unit 4, Top Priority. The date on the manifest was October 1968. Caleb recognized the project name from history documentaries. Greek Island was the code name for the secret government bunker built under the Greenbrier Resort in West Virginia, designed to house the U.S. Congress in the event of a nuclear war. This engine had been commissioned to keep the lights on for the survival of the American government during the apocalypse. But the logbook contained a final, handwritten entry in red ink, Unit 4 delivery cancelled. Diverted to storage. Security hold. The engine hadn't been rejected for mechanical failure. It had been diverted and then lost in the bureaucratic shuffle of the Cold War, sitting in a field while the bunker it was meant to power remained a classified secret for another 30 years. This provenance didn't just add value, it made the engine a historical artifact of immense significance. However, historical significance wouldn't pay the electric bill unless the engine actually turned. A seized engine of this size was effectively an 80,000-pound paperweight. The pistons in a 645 series engine were 9 inches in diameter, and if the piston rings had rusted to the cylinder liners over the last 50 years, no amount of lubricant would free them. They needed to perform a bar-over test. This involved manually rotating the engine's crankshaft using a specialized tool and a breaker bar to ensure the internal components moved freely before even thinking about applying power to the starters. Silas retrieved the barring tool from their heavy diesel tool crib. It was a geared device that fit into the flywheel housing, allowing a human to turn the massive crankshaft slowly. Before they could attempt to turn it, they had to open the cylinder test valves, known as cylinder cocks, on each of the 20 cylinders. These small valves allowed air to escape the combustion chambers. Without opening them, the compression of the massive cylinders would make manual rotation impossible. Caleb climbed onto the engine's catwalks, moving down the line with a wrench. As he cracked each valve open, he listened intently. A hiss of escaping pressurized gas would indicate a problem, but each valve opened with a neutral mechanical click. The engine wasn't pressurized, which was good. The moment of truth arrived. Silas inserted the barring tool into the port on the side of the engine block and attached a long steel breaker bar for leverage. He braced his feet against the skid and applied pressure. The resistance was immense. The friction of 20 massive pistons, the crankshaft, and the heavy generator rotor all had to be overcome from a dead stop. For a moment, nothing moved. Silas grunted with effort, his face reddening. Caleb watched the flywheel through the inspection port, holding his breath. If it was stuck, the dream ended here. Then, with a low, visceral groan of metal on oil, the flywheel inched forward. "It's moving!" Caleb shouted. Silas reset his grip and pushed again. The engine turned. It was stiff, the cold preservation grease acting like glue, but it was smooth. There was no grinding, no metal-on-metal screeching that would indicate a rusted cylinder or a spun bearing. The engine was free. They rotated the engine a full 360 degrees, watching the pistons rise and fall through the open cylinder test valves. It was a mechanical ballet. But as they completed the full rotation, Caleb noticed something unusual near the airbox inspection covers on the left bank of the engine. The airbox on a two-stroke diesel is a pressurized chamber surrounding the cylinders, allowing intake air to enter. The covers were bolted shut, but one of them had a different type of bolt head than the others, a security Torx bit that didn't match the standard hex heads used by EMD in the 1960s. It was a modern modification, or at least a modification made after the engine left the factory floor but before it was abandoned. Curiosity piqued, Caleb grabbed the specialized bit driver. Why would a sealed, diverted engine have a non-standard bolt on an airbox cover? He removed the bolt, then the standard ones surrounding it. The heavy steel cover came loose, revealing the dark, cavernous space of the airbox where the cylinder liners were visible. He shone his flashlight inside, expecting to see the silver shine of the cylinder liners and the intake ports. The liners were there, pristine and coated in oil. But sitting on the floor of the airbox, wedged between two cylinder liners in a space that should have been empty for airflow, was a heavy, canvas-wrapped object. It wasn't a mechanical part. It was a package, roughly the size of a shoebox, wrapped in oil-impregnated canvas and secured with heavy twine. It had been placed there deliberately, hidden in the one place no one would look unless they were performing a deep maintenance overhaul. The engine had been used as a safe deposit box. Caleb reached in, his gloved hand grasping the object. It was heavy, dense, and rigid. He pulled it out carefully, ensuring he didn't scratch the delicate cylinder liners. He set the package on the engine's walkway. The twine was brittle with age. Silas climbed up to join him, the barring tool forgotten. They weren't just dealing with a government surplus engine anymore. They had found something that someone had stashed away during the chaotic diversion of a top-secret project. Caleb cut the twine. Inside the canvas was a metal box, not unlike a munition tin, but without markings. He popped the latch. The contents were not gold or jewels, but something that confused them even more, a set of intricate machined prototype fuel injectors and a thick file of blueprints stamped "Noford, Experimental, High Output." The injectors looked alien compared to the standard EMD parts. They were complex, with additional solenoids and wiring harnesses that didn't exist in 1968 technology. The blueprints detailed a modification to the engine to run on a multi-fuel high-density compound. The brothers realized the engine wasn't just a backup for a bunker. It was a testbed for a propulsion technology that never officially existed. And right beneath the blueprints, nesting in a cutout in the foam, was a set of keys and a map with coordinates pointing to a location not far from the rail yard where they had bought the unit. The engine was the first clue in a scavenger hunt left by a defecting engineer or a shutdown department. They had the power source. Now they had the map to whatever the power source was meant to activate. The discovery of the experimental fuel injectors shifted the brothers' perspective entirely. They were no longer looking at a piece of history. They were holding a piece of suppressed technology. Caleb took one of the injectors to the workbench, placing it under a magnifying loupe. The machining was exquisite, far superior to the standard industrial tolerances of the 1960s. Standard injectors of that era were purely mechanical, relying on fuel pressure to pop a spring-loaded valve. These, however, contained strange, ceramic-tipped nozzles and a secondary fluid port that didn't exist on any commercial diesel engine. The accompanying blueprints confirmed their suspicion. These were dual-stage hypergolic injectors. The engine was designed to start on standard diesel and then switch to the experimental high-density compound for massive power bursts. The documents hinted that this system could push the engine's output from 3,600 horsepower to over 5,000 for short durations, a capability that would have been invaluable for a bunker needing to power directed energy weapons or massive radar arrays during a crisis. The map found in the box was a standard U.S. Geological Survey topographical quadrangle from 1967, but it had been heavily annotated with red grease pencil. The coordinates circled were located only 40 miles from the auction site where they had bought the generator. It was an area known locally as the Black Woods, a dense, boggy tract of land that had been fenced off by the government decades ago, ostensibly for environmental remediation, though no one ever saw cleanup crews. The brothers looked at each other. They had the engine, they had the specialized parts to upgrade it, and now they had a map pointing to the source of the fuel or the testing facility. The salvage job had turned into a treasure hunt. They secured the shop, loaded their truck with bolt cutters, flashlights, air quality monitors, and the mysterious set of keys, and set off into the gray afternoon. The drive was tense. As they turned off the main highway onto the gravel logging roads leading toward the coordinates, the trees grew thicker, blotting out the weak sunlight. The road hadn't been maintained in years. Branches whipped against the side of their heavy-duty pickup, and potholes threatened to swallow the axles. The GPS on the dashboard was useless here, displaying only a blank green void. They navigated solely by the odometer and the old paper map, counting the tenths of a mile from the last landmark, a collapsed wooden bridge. Finally, the road ended abruptly at a rusted heavy-gauge chain-link fence topped with razor wire. The gate was secured with a heavy padlock, but the chain was so rusted it looked like it would crumble at a touch. However, Caleb noticed something odd. The lock wasn't rusted. It was old, a heavy brass model, but it was cared for. Caleb stepped out of the truck, the silence of the woods pressing in on them. He approached the gate, the set of keys from the engine box jingling in his hand. He tried the largest key, a square-headed brass one. It slid into the padlock with a satisfying, oily click. He turned it, and the shackle popped open. Someone had been maintaining this lock, or at least, the lock was high quality enough to survive 50 years of exposure. They swung the gate open, the hinges screaming in protest, and drove through. Beyond the fence, the road changed from gravel to cracked, weed-choked asphalt. They were on an old industrial access road. A mile in, the trees cleared, revealing a concrete structure built into the side of a steep earthen berm. It looked like a tunnel entrance, sealed by a massive, blast-proof steel door. This was the location marked on the map. It wasn't a building, it was a hardened storage bunker or a rail tunnel. The tracks leading up to the door were visible through the overgrown grass, standard gauge rails that disappeared under the steel barrier. The door itself had no handle, only a small, key-operated control box mounted on a concrete pillar nearby. Silas checked the air monitor. Oxygen levels were normal, and there was no radiation. He nodded to Caleb. Caleb inserted a smaller, round-barrel key into the control box. He expected nothing. The power should have been cut decades ago. But as he turned the key, he felt a mechanical resistance, a heavy clunk of a purely analog switching mechanism. Deep inside the earth, a counterweight shifted. The ground vibrated slightly, not from an electric motor, but from a gravity-fed hydraulic system releasing its pressure. The massive steel door groaned, a sound like a dying whale, and began to slide horizontally into the concrete berm. It moved only a few feet before grinding to a halt, stuck on 50 years of debris, but the gap was wide enough for them to squeeze through. The brothers grabbed their high-powered flashlights and slipped into the darkness. The air inside was cool, dry, and smelled intensely of ozone and old dust. It was a stagnant, tomb-like atmosphere. Their beams cut through the darkness, revealing a cavernous concrete tunnel, curving away to the left. The rail tracks continued, and sitting on them about 100 yards in was a shape that made them stop in their tracks. It was a rail car, but not a standard boxcar or hopper. It was a thermos bottle car, a specialized, heavily insulated tanker used for transporting molten metal or volatile chemicals. The tank was painted a stark white, now gray with dust, and bore the same warning symbols as the blueprints, a red triangle with a lightning bolt and a chemical retort. Stenciled on the side was, USX Experimental. Do not hump. They approached the tanker cautiously. It was coupled to a small, battery-electric switcher locomotive, a tiny engine designed for moving cars within hazardous environments where sparks from a diesel exhaust could be fatal. The switcher looked dead, its batteries likely corroded into dust, but the tanker was the prize. Caleb climbed the ladder to the tanker's dome. The inspection hatch was sealed with another heavy padlock. He used the final key on the ring. It turned. He carefully lifted the heavy steel lid. A hiss of escaping gas made him recoil, but the air monitor didn't spike. It was a nitrogen blanket, used to keep the contents inert. He shone his light inside. The tank wasn't empty. It was half full of a thick, viscous purple liquid that shimmered with an oily iridescence. It looked like liquid mercury mixed with diesel fuel. This was the high-density compound. The brothers realized they were standing on top of thousands of gallons of a forgotten, high-energy synthetic fuel, likely worth a fortune to chemical collectors or hazardous waste disposal teams, depending on its toxicity. But the real shock came when Silas explored the small switcher engine. In the cab, resting on the operator's seat, was a clipboard with a log sheet. The last entry wasn't from 1968. It was dated just 3 weeks ago. The blood drained from Silas's face. "Caleb," he whispered, the sound carrying in the echoey tunnel. "Look at this." He held up the clipboard. The handwriting was shaky, but the date was unmistakable. Someone had been here. Recently. They had checked the pressure levels in the tank and marked them as stable. The brothers weren't discovering a lost tomb. They had broken into an active, albeit secret, storage site. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The auction of the generator hadn't been a mistake. It was a cleaning of house, or perhaps a trap. Or maybe, whoever was checking this tank didn't know the engine had been sold. Suddenly, a sound echoed from deeper within the tunnel, the distinct, rhythmic dripping of water, or perhaps footsteps. The tunnel didn't end at the tanker. It continued into the darkness. The brothers froze, killing their lights. In the pitch black, they heard it again, a metallic clang, like a tool being dropped on concrete, coming from far down the tracks. They were not alone in the facility. The engine in their shop was the key to unlocking the potential of this fuel, but being here, now, put them in immediate danger. They had walked into a site that was still being monitored by someone, or something. They had to decide, retreat and claim ignorance, or push forward to see who, or what, was guarding the rest of the supply. The lure of the mystery was overpowering. Caleb squeezed Silas's shoulder, a silent signal. They weren't leaving. They turned their lights back on to the lowest setting and began to creep past the tanker, heading deeper into the abyss of the tunnel. As they moved past the tanker, they noticed cables running along the wall. Modern, shielded fiber-optic cables that stood out against the crumbling 1960s concrete. These cables led toward a heavy blast door at the end of the siding, about 200 yards further in. The door was slightly ajar, spilling a faint, sickly yellow light into the tunnel. The hum of ventilation fans became audible, a low-frequency thrum that vibrated in their chests. This wasn't just a storage depot. It was an entrance to a subterranean facility that was still drawing power. The generator they bought was the emergency backup for this place, and by removing it, they might have triggered an alarm or a maintenance cycle that brought the inhabitants to the surface. Creeping up to the ajar blast door, Caleb peeked through the crack. What he saw defied the logic of a simple salvage operation. Beyond the door was a laboratory, not a dusty relic, but a clean, operational workspace filled with vintage computer banks mixed with modern servers. And in the center of the room, stripped down on a massive table, was another engine, identical to the one they had bought, but dismantled, its parts scattered as if someone was desperately trying to reverse engineer it. A man in a white lab coat was hunched over a microscope, his back to them. On the wall, a digital map displayed the location of their salvage yard with a pulsing red light. They were being tracked. The brothers realized the auction was a mistake, a clerical error that released a piece of hardware that this facility desperately needed back. And now, the buyers had delivered themselves right to the doorstep of the people who wanted it returned. The pulsing red light on the digital map was the only thing moving in the silent laboratory, blinking rhythmically over the exact GPS coordinates of Caleb and Silas's salvage yard. The realization that they were being digitally watched was terrifying, but the context on the screen was even more alarming. Next to the map was a status bar labeled Asset Recovery Team, en route, ETA 4 hours. The man in the lab coat wasn't just researching. He was coordinating a retrieval operation. He was likely a private contractor or a remnant of the program, desperate to recover the Unit 4 generator that had slipped through the cracks of a government liquidation algorithm. The brothers quickly pieced together the scenario. The automated federal auction system had flagged the obsolete generator for sale without cross-referencing the classified nature of its internal components. This scientist had likely been panic-stricken when he realized his critical hardware had been sold for scrap to two guys in a pickup truck. Caleb motioned for Silas to retreat. They had seen enough to know they were in immediate danger, but as they turned, Silas's boot scuffed a loose piece of concrete aggregate. The sound was sharp and echoed in the acoustic perfection of the underground chamber. The scientist spun around instantly, his face a mask of shock and fear. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for a frantic red button on his console. A klaxon began to blare, a harsh, rhythmic grinding sound that filled the tunnel. The heavy blast door they were peeking through hissed, the hydraulic locks engaging as it began to slide shut to seal the lab. The brothers didn't wait to see if the scientist wanted to talk. They bolted back into the darkness of the tunnel, their flashlights cutting wild arcs through the gloom as they sprinted past the hissing thermos bottle rail car. The run back to the surface was a lung-burning sprint against the closing mechanisms of the facility. The automated systems, dormant for decades, were waking up. Overhead lights flickered to life, buzzing angrily, and the ground began to vibrate as heavy ventilation shutters slammed closed further down the tunnel. They reached the entrance just as the outer blast door, the one they had opened with the key, began to grind shut. It was moving slowly, fighting years of rust, but its momentum was unstoppable. Caleb threw himself through the narrowing gap, grabbing Silas by the collar of his coveralls and hauling him through just as the massive slab of concrete and steel thudded into its frame, sealing the tunnel with a finality that shook the ground. They were out, but the facility was now in full lockdown mode. They scrambled into their truck, Caleb jamming the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he threw it into reverse, tires spinning on the mossy asphalt as he whipped the vehicle around. They tore out of the fenced compound, the heavy chain-link gate scraping along the side of the truck bed as they squeezed through. They didn't slow down until they were miles away, back on the public logging roads. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, calculating panic. The screen in the lab had said, ETA 4 hours. That was the timeline they had before a specialized team arrived at their shop to take back the engine, likely by force and certainly without a refund. They had a 4-hour head start to figure out what to do with an 80,000-pound piece of evidence. Driving back, the brothers formulated a plan. They couldn't hide the engine. It was too big. They couldn't run with it. It was too heavy. Their only advantage was possession and knowledge. They knew why the recovery team was coming. It wasn't just for the engine block. EMD 645s were rare but replaceable. It was for the injectors. The scientist in the lab had an identical engine stripped down, but he was clearly failing to make it work. The brothers deduced that the Unit 4 they bought contained the specific, prototype fuel injection system required to utilize the purple, high-density compound stored in the rail car. Without their engine, the fuel was useless sludge. Without the fuel, their engine was just a heavy generator. They held the ignition key to a billion-dollar energy project. They arrived back at the salvage yard with 2 hours to spare. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the piles of scrap steel and crushed cars. The warehouse looked vulnerable. They immediately went to work, not to hide the engine, but but to fortify their position and secure the asset. They used their heavy forklifts to stack shipping containers in front of the main bay doors, creating a physical barrier that would require heavy equipment to move. They welded the side doors shut. It was a siege mentality. Inside, they turned their attention back to the engine. Caleb realized that if the recovery team was coming, they would likely try to seize the engine legally, or quasi-legally, claiming it was stolen government property. The brothers needed to prove that the experimental nature of the engine was not classified, but rather declassified by negligence. They opened the crate containing the documents and the injectors again. Silas noticed something they had missed in the initial excitement. Tucked into the back of the logbook was a carbon copy of a material release order dated 1998. It was a request to strip the classified components from Unit 4 before disposal. The document was stamped "completed" by a localized site manager, but clearly the work had never been done. The laziness of a government employee 20 years ago was their legal shield. The engine had been sold as scrap, certified as demilitarized by the paperwork. Legally, the brothers owned every bolt, including the classified ones, because the government's own records said those parts didn't exist. They weren't holding stolen property. They were holding a clerical error that the government was desperate to erase. With 1 hour left on the countdown, they decided to remove the leverage. If the team stormed the building, they would take the engine. But they couldn't take the injectors if they weren't in the engine. Working with the precision of a pit crew, Caleb and Silas removed the 20 experimental injectors from the cylinder heads. It was intricate work, requiring the specialized tools found in the box. They wrapped each injector in oily rags and placed them into 2 heavy-duty Pelican cases. They then took the blueprints, the map, and the keys. These items were the real value. The 80,000-pound iron block was just the vessel. They hid the cases inside the hollow boom of their largest crane, a hiding spot that no search dog or sweeping team would check, located 30 feet in the air. As they finished wiping down the engine to remove their fingerprints and the signs of tampering, the sound of heavy tires on gravel drifted in from the main road. The ETA had been accurate. Caleb climbed up to the high windows of the warehouse office, peering through the dusty glass. A convoy of 3 black SUVs and a heavy-duty flatbed truck with government plates pulled up to the main gate. They didn't look like police. They looked like private military contractors, clean, efficient, and heavily armed. A man in a suit stepped out of the lead vehicle, holding a megaphone. He didn't ask for entry. He announced a federal asset recovery audit. The brothers stood in the center of the warehouse, the massive green engine looming behind them. They were dirty, tired, and armed only with a comprehensive knowledge of maritime law and a very large oxyacetylene torch. They weren't going to open the doors. They were going to force the audit team to negotiate. Caleb grabbed his phone and started a live stream. It was a modern defense mechanism. If they disappeared, the story died. If they were live, 50,000 salvage enthusiasts would witness the government trying to steal back a legally purchased generator. He hit "Go Live," the notification pinging out to their subscribers. "Hey guys," Caleb said to the camera, his voice steady but tense. "Remember that engine we found? Well, the previous owners are outside, and they brought an army. We're about to find out what's really inside this thing." The standoff had begun. The man outside signaled to his team. 2 men approached the gate with bolt cutters. The lock snapped, and the gate swung open. The convoy rolled into the yard, stopping just short of the wall of shipping containers. The suit walked forward, flanked by 2 tactical operators. He stopped at the gap between the containers and looked up at the camera Caleb was holding in the window. He held up a piece of paper, a federal warrant. But Caleb knew warrants took days to process for a civil dispute. This was a forgery, or a national security letter designed to intimidate. He opened the window a crack. "Trespassing," Caleb shouted. "This is private property. We have the receipt." The suit smiled, a cold, predatory expression. "Mr. Vance," he shouted back, using Caleb's last name, "we aren't here for the scrap. We are here for the hazardous materials contained within Lot 409. You are in possession of Class 1 restricted technology. Open the bay, or we will breach." The mention of hazardous materials was the cover story. They were going to claim the engine was radioactive or toxic to seize it without paying. But Caleb knew the Geiger counter had been flat. It was a bluff. "We removed the hazardous parts." Caleb lied, shouting back, "It's just a block of iron now. The injectors are gone." The suit's smile vanished instantly. The bluff had landed. The suit touched his earpiece, his face darkening. He knew that without the injectors, the recovery was a failure. The dynamic shifted instantly from a raid to a negotiation. The standoff in the salvage yard shifted from a potential tactical breach to a high-stakes psychological chess match. The presence of the live stream was the brothers' most powerful weapon. Thousands of viewers were now watching the confrontation in real time, their comments scrolling rapidly across the screen of Caleb's phone. The man in the suit, realizing that a violent entry would be broadcast instantly to the world, signaled his tactical team to lower their weapons. The optics of a government hit squad raiding a small business over a generator were impossible to contain. He adjusted his tie, walked to the chain-link fence, and held up his hands in a universal gesture of truce. He wasn't retreating, but he was changing the rules of engagement. He pointed to the gate, then to himself, indicating he wanted to talk, alone and unarmed. Caleb and Silas conferred quickly. They had the leverage of the hidden injectors and the public eye, but they were physically trapped. Opening the gate was a risk, but keeping it closed would eventually lead to a legal siege they couldn't afford. They agreed to the parley. Silas moved the forklift, blocking the main entrance just enough to create a pedestrian gap, while Caleb kept the camera rolling, narrating every movement to his digital audience as a form of insurance. The suit walked into the dimly lit warehouse, his eyes scanning the space with the precision of a hawk. He ignored the piles of scrap and walked straight to the EMD engine. He ran a gloved hand over the empty cylinder heads where the experimental injectors had been just an hour ago. He didn't look angry. He looked resigned, perhaps even desperate. The conversation that followed was conducted in low tones, drowned out by the hum of the warehouse fans to prevent the live stream microphone from picking up sensitive details. The agent, who introduced himself simply as Director Sterling, dropped the pretense of the stolen property. He admitted the engine was legally purchased, a catastrophic error by the General Services Administration's automated liquidation software. However, he revealed the terrified truth behind the frantic recovery effort. The facility the brothers had stumbled upon, the bunker in the Black Woods, was not just a storage site. It was a containment vessel for the remaining stock of Compound 7, the purple hypergolic fuel stored in the thermos car. The fuel was chemically unstable. It had a shelf life, and that shelf life had expired 10 years ago. Sterling explained that the scientist the brothers had seen, Dr. Eris, had been monitoring the pressure buildup in the tanker car. The compound was decomposing, creating a volatile gas that threatened to rupture the tank. If the tank breached, the resulting toxic cloud would necessitate the evacuation of 3 counties. The only way to neutralize the fuel safely was to burn it. But Compound 7 burned at temperatures that would melt a standard engine. The EMD 20-645E3 Unit 4, sitting in their shop, was the only machine in existence capable of processing the fuel. It had been built with experimental metallurgy, sodium-filled exhaust valves, ceramic-coated piston crowns, and the crucial dual-stage injectors, specifically to withstand the thermal load of the compound. The scientist had been trying to build a replica engine in the lab but failed. The metallurgy of the 1960s was, ironically, superior to the hurried fabrication of his modern attempts. They didn't just need the engine back to hide a secret. They needed it to prevent an environmental disaster that was hours away from happening. The brothers realized the magnitude of their position. They weren't holding a piece of scrap. They were holding the pressure release valve for a chemical bomb. The audit wasn't a seizure. It was a plea for help disguised as a raid. Caleb, keeping the camera pointed at the floor but still live, negotiated hard. He demanded that the operation be reclassified. They would not surrender the engine. Instead, they would be hired as civilian contractors to transport and operate the machinery. They demanded a contract, signed on the spot, indemnifying them from any damage and guaranteeing a payment that reflected the specialized nature of the emergency salvage work. They quoted a figure that made Sterling flinch: $250,000 for the rental of the engine and their expertise, plus the original ownership rights returned to them after the operation. Sterling made a call on his encrypted satellite phone. The conversation was brief. He hung up and nodded. The government had no time to haggle. The pressure readings in the bunker were spiking. The deal was struck. The live-stream audience was told that the misunderstanding had been resolved and that the brothers were assisting with a time-sensitive government project. The camera was cut, preserving the secrecy of the next phase. The tone of the night changed instantly. The tactical team outside didn't breach the gate. They entered as laborers. The private military contractors holstered their weapons and began helping Silas rig the 80,000-pound engine for transport. The heavy-duty flatbed truck backed into the bay, its air brakes hissing. They worked with feverish intensity. The brothers retrieved the Pelican cases from the crane boom, revealing the pristine, experimental injectors. Sterling watched with visible relief as the components were brought into the light. Reinstalling them was not an option in the shop. There wasn't time. They would have to install the fuel system on-site at the bunker while the engine was being hooked up to the tanker. The engine was chained down to the lowboy trailer, the suspension groaning under the massive weight. Caleb and Silas threw their tools into their own truck, following the convoy as it roared out of the salvage yard. They were no longer scrappers. They were the lead engineers on a classified hazmat disposal team. The drive back to the Black Woods was a blur of flashing lights. The convoy bypassed the logging roads, smashing through the rusted gates they had carefully picked earlier. When they arrived at the bunker entrance, the situation had deteriorated. The heavy steel blast door they had squeezed through was now fully open, and a crew in hazmat suits was setting up decontamination showers. The air smelled faintly of garlic, a telltale sign that the nitrogen blanket in the tanker was failing and the Compound 7 was beginning to off-gas. Dr. Eris ran out to meet them, looking frantic. He ignored Sterling and went straight to the engine on the trailer, patting the cold steel block as if it were a savior. He confirmed that tank pressure was critical. They had less than 3 hours before the safety valves blew. The plan was audacious. They couldn't move the tanker out. It was too unstable to travel over the rough tracks. They had to bring the mountain to the Muhammad. They had to maneuver the massive engine into the tunnel, couple it to the tanker's fuel lines, and run it at full throttle to consume the fuel as it expanded. It was a suicide mission for the machinery. The engine would be run until it likely melted down or seized, sacrificing itself to burn off the poison. The brothers used the heavy recovery winch on the government truck to slide the engine off the trailer and onto the rails, mounting it on a set of temporary bogies, heavy-duty steel wheels that allowed the generator to act like a rail car. Pushing the engine into the tunnel was a surreal experience. The brothers, wearing borrowed respirators and hazmat suits, guided the massive green block down the tracks, past the blast doors, and deep into the earth. The temperature inside the tunnel had risen significantly since their visit hours ago. The chemical reaction in the tank was generating heat. The thermos bottle car was groaning, the metal expanding under the pressure. They shoved the engine up against the tanker. Dr. Eris and Silas immediately went to work on the plumbing. They had to connect the tanker's output valve to the engine's intake manifold, bypassing the standard fuel filters. Meanwhile, Caleb began the intricate work of reinstalling the 20 experimental injectors. His hands were steady, but his heart pounded. Each injector had to be seated perfectly and torqued to spec. If one leaked, the hypergolic fuel would ignite on contact with the air, turning the tunnel into a blast furnace. Sterling stood back, watching the pressure gauge on the tanker. The needle was creeping into the red zone. "Faster," he urged, his voice tight. Silas was wrestling with a high-pressure hose, his wrench slipping on the oily fitting. "I need a cheater pipe," he yelled, his voice muffled by the mask. Caleb threw him a length of steel tubing. With a final, desperate heave, Silas cinched the connection. The fuel line was solid. Caleb tightened the last bolt on the 20th injector. The engine was reassembled. It was time to wake the giant. But there was a problem. The engine had no batteries connected, and the air start system relied on a compressor they didn't have. They had to jump the starter motors using the high-voltage cables from the facility's grid. Dr. Eris ran a heavy cable from a wall junction box. "It's going to be a hard start," the scientist warned. "The fuel is thick. If it doesn't catch on the first rotation, the injectors will flood and we'll have a runaway." A runaway diesel engine was a mechanic's nightmare, an engine that consumes its own oil or excess fuel and accelerates uncontrollably until it explodes. In a confined tunnel, next to a bomb, it was a death sentence. Caleb climbed into the control cab they had rigged up on the side of the engine. He grasped the manual throttle lever. He looked at Silas, who gave him a thumbs up. He looked at Sterling, who was praying. Caleb hit the starter button. The massive electric motors whined, engaging the flywheel. The engine turned over slowly. Chug, chug, chug. It was fighting the compression and the thick, sludge-like fuel. It didn't fire. The whine of the starters dropped in pitch as the facility's breakers threatened to trip. "Come on," Caleb gritted out. He pumped the manual primer. Suddenly, cylinder number 5 caught with a sound like a shotgun blast. Then number 12. Then the whole bank. A massive cloud of black smoke erupted from the exhaust stacks, instantly filling the top of the tunnel. The engine roared to life, not with the smooth hum of a diesel, but with the jagged, aggressive idle of a dragster. It was running on the unstable Compound 7. The sound was deafening, a physical pressure wave that shook the dust from the ceiling. Caleb checked the gauges. The RPMs were hunting, surging up and down. The engine was angry. "Open the main valve." Dr. Eris screamed over the noise. Silas reached for the tanker valve and cranked it open. The purple liquid rushed into the fuel rails. The engine note changed instantly from a roar to a high-pitched scream. The turbochargers spooled up to a whistle that pierced their ear protection. The EMD 20-645E3 began to eat the poison, the needle on the tanker's pressure gauge wavering, then holding. It was working. The EMD 20-645E3 was no longer just an engine. It had become a mechanical dragon breathing fire in a concrete cave. The transition to the pure, Compound 7 fuel had pushed the machine beyond its factory specifications. The 20 cylinders were hammering with such violence that the temporary steel wheels the brothers had mounted the engine on were starting to spark against the rails. The noise was a physical assault, a wall of sound that penetrated their heavy-duty ear defenders and vibrated their vision. The exhaust manifolds, usually a dull cast iron gray, were beginning to glow a dull, menacing cherry red. The heat radiating from the block was intense, pushing the temperature in the tunnel to over 110 degrees within minutes. They were standing next to a controlled explosion, hoping the 50-year-old cast iron wouldn't shatter under the thermal shock. However, a new, critical problem emerged immediately. Dr. Eris, watching the telemetry on his laptop, began waving his arms frantically, pointing at the frequency gauge. Caleb looked at the analog dial on the generator head. The needle was burying itself past 60 Hertz, climbing toward 70. The engine was overspeeding. In their haste to burn the fuel, they had forgotten a fundamental law of power generation. You cannot run a generator at full throttle without a load, an electrical resistance to push against. Without a load, the massive engine had no work to do, and the experimental fuel was spinning the rotor faster and faster. If the generator head spun too fast, The centrifugal force would rip the copper windings apart, turning the massive rotor into a shrapnel grenade that would kill them all and rupture the tanker. They needed to dump 3 megawatts of power, and they needed to do it instantly. They couldn't just ground it to the rails. That would weld the wheels and likely electrocute them. They needed a load bank, a massive resistor designed to absorb energy. Where does the power go? Caleb signaled to Silas, pointing to the thick, braided copper cables coming off the generator. They ran along the floor, disappearing into a conduit in the wall. The facility had to have a main distribution panel. If they could connect the generator to the facility's dormant grid and turn on every light, heater, and fan in the bunker, they might create enough resistance to slow the engine down. Silas grabbed a voltage tester and sprinted toward the blast door, following the conduit. He entered the main breaker room, a dusty chamber filled with rows of gray switchgear cabinets from the 1960s. The air here was stagnant, undisturbed for decades. He traced the generator input cables to a massive breaker labeled Auxiliary Input, Unit 4. It was currently in the open position. To create the load, he needed to close this breaker and then close the main bus tie. But he hesitated. The panel warned, danger. High voltage, verify phase sync. Throwing a 3 megawatt switch onto a dead grid was dangerous. If there was a short circuit anywhere in the miles of tunnel wiring, the resulting arc flash would vaporize him. Back at the engine, Caleb was fighting the governor. He was manually holding the throttle linkage, trying to force the engine to idle down, but the hypergolic fuel was too potent. The engine wanted to run. "It's going to blow," Eris screamed, backing away from the screaming machine. The tachometer hit 1,000 revolutions per minute, the red line. The generator housing began to whine, a high-pitched scream overlaying the diesel roar. Caleb looked toward the breaker room door, praying for his brother. Inside the breaker room, Silas made a choice. He didn't have time to test the circuits. He donned a pair of rotting rubber lineman's gloves he found on a hook, took a deep breath, and grabbed the heavy throw handle of the main breaker. He slammed it upward. K-chunk. The sound was like a gunshot. A massive spark showered from the top of the cabinet, but the connection held. The effect in the tunnel was instantaneous. The lights, which had been dim and yellow, suddenly blazed with blinding, stadium-level intensity. Ventilation fans that had been seized with rust for years groaned and then roared to life, blowing clouds of ancient dust into the air. But the most important change was in the engine. The moment the electrical load hit, the generator encountered massive magnetic resistance. The engine bogged down, the pitch dropping from a high scream to a deep, guttural growl. The black smoke from the stacks turned a thick, efficient gray. The RPMs dropped to a steady 900. The beast had been tamed by the burden of powering the entire underground complex. Caleb slumped against the control rail, sweat pouring down his face inside the hazmat suit. The immediate danger of the engine exploding was past. It was now chewing through the fuel at a steady rate. Dr. Eris gave a thumbs up. The pressure in the tanker was dropping. They were winning. But as the adrenaline faded, the brothers noticed something strange. The facility wasn't just lighting up, it was waking up. The power they were generating was going somewhere specific. In the breaker room, Silas noticed that the majority of the current wasn't going to the lights or the fans. The ammeter showed that 80% of the power, nearly 2.5 megawatts, was being drawn by a single circuit labeled TX alpha. He followed the label to a conduit that led deeper into the earth, far past the laboratory they had seen earlier. Back in the tunnel, the ground began to hum with a new frequency, distinct from the engine's vibration. It was a low-frequency pulse, rhythmic and powerful. Caleb walked over to the laboratory monitors, which had all flickered to life. The screens were no longer showing error messages. They were displaying a boot sequence for a system called Gorgon. A map of the northern hemisphere appeared, with vector lines radiating from their location in the Black Woods. Dr. Eris stared at the screen, his face draining of color. "Turn it off," he whispered. "We have to disconnect the load." Caleb didn't understand. "We can't," he shouted back. "If we disconnect the load, the engine overspeeds and blows up the tanker." They were in a catch-22. To save the town from the chemical cloud, they had to run the engine. To run the engine, they had to power the grid. But powering the grid had activated TX Alpha. "What is TX Alpha?" Silas asked, rejoining them. "It's a VLF transmitter," Eris said, his voice trembling. "Very low frequency. It was designed to send doomsday orders to submerged submarines in the event that Washington fell. It hasn't transmitted since 1970. If it starts broadcasting now, with this power level, every military listening post from here to Moscow is going to pick it up. They won't see it as a test. They'll see it as a reactivation of a nuclear command node." As if to confirm his fears, the facility's internal PA system crackled to life. It wasn't a voice. It was a series of screeching data bursts, cryptographic codes being blasted out into the atmosphere by the massive antenna buried somewhere in the mountain above them. The brothers had inadvertently turned the salvage operation into an international incident. They were broadcasting a ghost signal from the Cold War. Sterling, the agent, was already on his satellite phone, shouting to be heard over the engine. He looked terrified. "Abort!" he yelled at the brothers. "Cut the fuel. We have NORAD on the line. They are tracking a massive signal bloom from this coordinate." "We can't cut the fuel," Caleb yelled back, pointing at the tanker. "The valve is jammed open by the pressure. If we stop the engine, the back pressure blows the lines." They were committed. The engine was the only thing eating the poison, but it was also powering a beacon that was screaming to the world that the U.S. government was preparing for war. They had to find a way to sever the connection to the transmitter without removing the load from the engine. They needed to divert the power to something else, something that would consume 3 megawatts without broadcasting a signal. They needed a dummy load of epic proportions. Caleb looked around the industrial tunnel. His eyes landed on the massive cooling water cisterns that lined the far wall, huge concrete tanks filled with thousands of gallons of stagnant water, used to cool the facility's original reactors. "The water!" Caleb shouted. "Water is a resistor. If we drop the main power cables into the cistern, the water will boil. It will act as a giant load bank." It was basic, dangerous physics. They would essentially be turning the cistern into a giant electric kettle. It was incredibly risky. If the cables touched each other, it would be a dead short. But if they spaced them apart, the water would conduct the electricity, turning the energy into steam. They had minutes before the military, or someone worse, decided that the best way to stop the rogue transmission was to bomb the transmitter site. Silas grabbed the bolt cutters. "I'll cut the feed to the transmitter," he yelled. "Caleb, get the emergency cables ready to dump into the tank." They were racing against 2 clocks now, the pressure in the fuel tanker and the patience of the strategic command watching a dead base come back to life. Silas sprinted back to the breaker room, intending to hack through a live 4,000-volt conduit, while Caleb dragged heavy copper leads toward the dark, oily water of the cistern. The engine roared on, indifferent to the chaos, consuming the purple sludge and converting it into a signal that could start a war. The race to silence the doomsday signal before a military strike was launched came down to a crude, desperate experiment in thermodynamics. Caleb dragged the heavy, rubber-sheathed emergency cables toward the lip of the concrete cistern, the copper ends gleaming in the harsh work lights. The water below was black and stagnant, a 50,000-gallon resistor waiting to be awakened. Meanwhile, in the breaker room, Silas stood before the open cabinet of the TX Alpha circuit. He didn't have time for a clean shutdown. He gripped the insulated handle of the main disconnect switch, knowing that pulling it under load would create a massive arc flash. He turned his head away, held his breath, and yanked the lever down with all his weight. The breaker room was illuminated by a blinding flash of blue-white light as the air ionized, the thunderclap of the braking circuit shaking the dust from the ceiling. Simultaneously, the lights in the tunnel flickered and dimmed. The engine, sensing the sudden loss of resistance, began to scream again, the RPMs shooting toward the red line. Caleb didn't hesitate. As the engine revved up, threatening to self-destruct, he threw the heavy copper cables into the cistern, spacing them 10 feet apart. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The 3 megawatts of raw power found a path through the water. The liquid didn't just heat up, it exploded into energy. A shock wave rippled across the surface of the tank, and a column of superheated steam erupted toward the tunnel ceiling. The engine bogged down heavily, the governor fighting to maintain speed against the immense new load. The VLF transmitter was dead. Its signal cut the moment Silas pulled the handle. The screens in the laboratory went black, the map of the targeting vectors vanishing. They had successfully diverted the power. Now, the tunnel was filling with a dense white fog as the cistern boiled, reducing visibility to 0. The brothers and the scientists were forced to the floor, breathing through their respirators, listening to the terrified roar of the EMD engine as it consumed the final gallons of the purple sludge. It was a mechanical endurance test. The exhaust manifolds were glowing a translucent orange, illuminating the steam like lightning in a storm cloud. For 20 agonizing minutes, the machine raged, drinking the poison that had threatened the town. And then, abruptly, the pitch changed. The roar sputtered, coughed, and died. The fuel lines from the tanker were empty. The engine spun down, the momentum of the massive flywheel keeping it turning for a few seconds before it shuddered to a final, clanking halt. The silence that followed was heavy and wet, broken only by the bubbling of the boiling cistern and the ticking of cooling metal. The thermos bottle car was silent. The pressure gauge had dropped to 0. The volatile compound 7 was gone, converted into heat, steam, and harmless exhaust. The aftermath of the operation was a blur of debriefings and non-disclosure agreements. The brothers emerged from the tunnel into the cool night air of the Black Woods, covered in soot and sweat, to find the perimeter secured by a different kind of team, cleanup crews and lawyers. Director Sterling was true to his word. The crisis had been averted without public panic, and the signal bloom was written off as an atmospheric anomaly caused by a solar flare. The government needed the incident buried, and the quickest way to bury it was to pay the witnesses and send them home. The settlement was substantial. The initial rental fee of $250,000 was paid immediately, but the hazard pay and the silence fee pushed the total compensation to nearly $4 million. The brothers, who had started the week worrying about the price of scrap steel, were now multimillionaires. But the most surprising part of the deal was the engine itself. The government had no use for a toasted, overstressed engine block that was officially listed as scrapped decades ago. They allowed Caleb and Silas to keep it, provided the experimental injectors were surrendered. Mark and Peter, or rather Caleb and Silas in this new chapter of their lives, returned to their salvage yard not as scrappers, but as legends in the industrial underground. They used the money to overhaul their business, buying modern equipment and securing their future. As for the EMD 20-645E3, they didn't scrap it. They spent months cleaning the soot, polishing the scorched paint, and rebuilding the damaged internals. They mounted the massive green beast on a concrete plinth in the center of their new showroom. It would never run again. The thermal stress had fused the pistons to the liners, but it stood as a monument to the night they saved the world with a rusted generator. They eventually posted a video about the restoration of the external parts of the engine, carefully omitting the bunker, the fuel, and the secret signal. The comments section was filled with people marveling at the size of the machine, asking if they would ever fire it up. Caleb would just smile at the camera, pat the side of the silent iron giant, and say, "Some engines have already done enough work for a lifetime." The brothers had bought a tugboat of a generator for scrap, but they had salvaged a fortune and a story they could never fully tell, the ultimate find in a life of hunting rust.